Brett, you are very knowledgeable about the auction and the system of the auction. So I would like to have your feeling about the last week auction in a very special period, right?
Right. Look, I think we all went into the last 2 weeks with a lot of trepidation, because the story that we had in Paris with the art fairs, the story we saw in London, the story before that we saw in Hong Kong, we're talking really 3 or 4 weeks prior to the auctions, was very depressing. This was not feeling that the market was with us. There was a lot of talk that ultimately things have moved, but most importantly, the war is right on top of us. And I think that the timing of that, obviously, exactly at the time of London, exactly, going into Paris, created a huge cloud, which was already, joining a cloud. Many other clouds were there, but it ultimately took a lot of people's focus away. So the real test, or the real public test, obviously, beyond the art fair, was the auctions. And many of the things which were in the auctions were preset. I mean, this was a long season for the auction houses, highly competitive season. And Sotheby's won the big collections. And because of that, Christie's had to take a very different approach, which they went singly after individual objects. And sometimes that works very well in a market which is about trophy buying, because if you don't have a collection, but you have the 3 or 4 top items that people want in the marketplace, that can give you as much access to the top buyers as having, a broad spread of material. So because of the fact that many of these works were preset, meaning that the guarantees were either done before the war, certainly before a lot of the turbulence that we've seen most recently, you already had, a buying market, or at least a stage being set, which shows before and after in a certain way. But then more importantly, how are the auction houses going to deal with the now? And I think what we saw most particularly last night was an auction house, this is Sotheby's, auction houses being very professional, being very diligent in what they're doing, but taking quite drastic action in several cases, because they withdraw quite a lot of lots from the sales, and they withdrew them to the point where, they disappear.
There was 8 withdraw.
There were 8 withdrawals.
And today it has vanished off the catalog, which is a bit, wow, surprising. Huh?
Yeah, I think the difficulty also is, you look at the stats afterwards, and this is obviously what is confusing, because you see 92% sold, 96% sold sales. This is a very good story. But if you actually then drill down and you see that 8 works, as you say, were taken out of the sale, and if those 8 works had remained in the sale, most likely they were withdrawn because they were not going to sell, that would have obviously told a very different percentage story.
Of course.
You would still have had the success of the work selling, but ultimately, obviously, the cloud would be very much more visible, and the cloud is there. However, I think one of the things which I give great compliments to all 3 of the auction houses, and we'll see tonight Phillips doing what they have to do. But again, everyone is trying to pivot and make the best of what they can. As I said at the beginning, a lot of what was available was not consciously thought through for the last 3 or 4 weeks of where the buyers are. It was thought 6 months ago when they were winning this business. So, you make a decision 6 months ago, you then have to live with it, and then you have to basically deal and find solutions. And the solutions that the auction houses have generally defined is obviously, if they've guaranteed the work themselves, and that's one of the things that was very interesting about going into the season, is that the 3 auction houses chose to do house guarantees, despite the fact that last season was actually not as good as everyone thinks, because you had the same situation with work selling to the guarantors, or basically a lot of material being guaranteed and sold off, and then selling on one bid to the guarantor. So it wasn't necessarily the best sign for an auction house to say, okay, we're going to take on Emily Fisher Landau and have such a big financial commitment, and then only try and sell them really at the last moment, which is one of the things that Sotheby's did. And I believe, again, they're not a public company any longer, but if one really added up what happened there, they lost a lot of money on a very big collection. That collection was highly competed for. And while they did very well on individual objects like the Agnes Martin, when world record price for nominal price, there were also very big casualties. So the Rothko, for instance, and Emily Fisher Landau, sold way below, $10 million below its estimate.
Because it was less commercial, right? It was dark.
Yeah, it was dark, and it's also from very important because it was part of the Seagram mural studies, but it was a very esoteric work. But also, there was another painting of Christie's which took a little bit of the fire away. It also only sold in one bid, and
it was a melon.
It was a melon painting, but it was also a painting that had been taken to art fairs, and was very well known in the market, but admittedly at a much higher price. But I think the story there was basically the fact that the auction houses obviously committed a lot of money, and all of them did, to these guarantees, and then they took the solutions was to find ultimately third parties who would take those guarantees. By doing that, it becomes expensive for the auction house, because ultimately, yes, you're selling it off, but you're only making then half your profit or your potential profit on each of those objects. But they would rather, in the case of the Sotheby's with the Rothko from Fisher Landau, they'd rather sell it and lose a $10 million position on that work than hold it and then basically find that they have to try and sell it later on. It's better that they take the loss now than basically have it over time. There was a Rothko painting that Sotheby's guaranteed in 2008, I remember, for $40 million. They eventually sold it in around 2012 or 13 for $20 million. They literally, and again, do you take the pain now or you take it later? So I think one of the things that we saw last night by them withdrawing these works, and again, it wasn't just that Sotheby's are doing it. You look at all the sales in London, there were a lot of, the amount of works that are being withdrawn from sales, if you add them up, it's probably a wholesale itself between the three houses. But it's a way of ultimately, obviously, dealing with a consignor who wants,
for sure,
who's not coming down with their numbers. And this material, obviously, the work that was being withdrawn was work which was not guaranteed. It was basically work that ultimately would not sell if they didn't take that action. So again, the question is really not so much about the withdrawal, it's about how you publicly tell people about that withdrawal and the fact that it disappears completely from a vision.
Yeah, which is a problem, I think. It created doubt about transparency.
I think so too, because again, we are all in the market where we're trying to understand pricing. And if you're looking for comps in the market, which ultimately is our job, I mean, as a dealer, but also,
exactly, as a journalist too.
Yeah, you're always
very difficult to get it. And also Christie's, they don't make a difference between the work withdrawn before the auction and the work withdrawn at the auction, which is not transparent either. But was there some disappointment for you?
Yeah, I mean, disappoint is too strong a word, because I think I was very pleased and very pleasantly surprised how well overall certain works performed. So the fact that you get a phenomenal price on a Diebenkorn painting, which is a very esoteric painting and a very esoteric artist, but the best of what it represented, great trophy, 44, 46, whatever it made with premium, great price, world record price, well beyond, but very difficult to replicate. It's not like you're going to say, well, that actually means that the whole Diebenkorn market is affected. And in fact, one of the paintings that was withdrawn from Sotheby's last night was a Diebenkorn. So it demonstrates exactly that, and a figurative one. So, we saw that the same thing happened, a few seasons ago when Jeff Koons record price for his bunny, and then it had zero impact. And in fact, the other areas of the market became even weaker on how the Koons market works. So it's not like you get one trophy price and then it
What about Joan Mitchell?
I mean, again, there was a lot of hype about the painting that Christie's had in terms of blowing all records. I mean, I posted it on my Instagram and I was getting comments, oh, it's going to be the first painting to make $50 million for a female artist. And I was like, really? It's a beautiful painting, but I don't see it. I think it was a fantastic price. I mean, $29 million for Joan Mitchell at this price. That's a record price. Now, there have been paintings that have sold. I mean, LVMH have got phenomenal triptychs, which, the asking prices of these would be in these ranges. But those are incredibly large scale and, museum style paintings. This is a domestic painting, I mean, a big scale painting, but still, coming from a private collection. And, despite all the demand for her work, we've yet to see an estimate like that. It was estimated 25 to 30. The previous world record price was around $16 million. So it really was a big jump in terms of expectation. And this is not a market necessarily that you can do that. You have to, and my own feeling here, and again, it's easy to say this in hindsight, and it's obviously difficult when you're dealing with a consignor who's making something competitive, and the auction houses are trying to win it, and they put more and more money to basically get the deal, and that obviously pushes up the estimate. But that's an exact example where if the seller had gone with an estimate of, let's say, $18 to $22 million, which would have been perceived as conservative, and especially by putting 18 to 22, the bridging the teens to the 20s, my own feeling is that painting would have made a much higher price, because the demand is there and the money's there. What is missing?
Is there a depth in the market of a new depth in the market of Joanne Mitchell now?
Oh, very much. Oh, very much. No, I mean, her market is incredible at all levels, but it needs, you can't then take that and say, okay, now we're going to push it to the highest level with the highest estimate and the highest this, when actually what markets need, and specifically auction markets, is need a run to show that ultimately that there's depth of bidding and there's actually excitement. I mean, there were 2 bidders apparently on that. There was a backer and one other bidder beyond it. But actually the interest beforehand, because we're working with a number of collectors who looked at the painting and just felt a little expensive. But they're the kind of people who frankly are wealthy enough that once they were in the fight, they would have gone beyond, and it would have been similar to what I believe would have happened with the Demon Corn. So the demand on the painting was the right painting. It was a late 50s, 60s painting, 50s, late 50s painting, and it had great substance and beautiful color. So
what are the kind of disappointment for you in this?
I mean, the disappointment for me was last night, for instance, the Baltus, because to see a painting of that, and the Chagall to a degree as well. And I think, to me, again, when I look at the pricings generally, most of the estimates, most of the prices achieved have been within their estimates. They've been, in some cases below estimates when things have not performed. But even when things are performing well, they're performing within their estimate spans. So, for instance, the Baltus was estimated at $12 to $18 million, $12 to $16 million, and it sold for a hammer of 12.5. And so it shows basically there were, at least two bidders who wanted it, but ultimately they had a very specific price in mind. And it reminds me, the same thing happened with the Picasso with the Marie-Thérèse that came from Fischer Landau. And it reminded me several years ago, actually, in the market in 2010, when the market was coming back, there was another great Marie-Thérèse that came for sale. And everyone, there were 5 or 6 bidders on it. And ultimately, this is when I was at Christie's, but everyone had exactly the same price in mind. And so the price was really between $1 or $2 million difference at the $100 million mark, but everyone just sat at the same position. And that was exactly what we saw now with, across the sales, but specifically with the Picasso, where you had, maybe 2 or 3 bidders who actually activated. I think there were 2 eventually. There was the backer, and then that 1 bid extra took it to 21.5 or 20, but literally 1 bid extra, and then it stopped. So, one of the sanguine aspects of this market, which I think is a good thing, is that people are being more realistic in terms of where they are. They have more knowledge in where they need to be. And I think one of the things that we are seeing, and this is not meant to be a criticism against Asia versus America versus Europe, but when you look at markets which are more difficult to read, or markets where there's more nuance, you need experience. And that's where actually the American European collectors have a greater advantage, because in many cases they've been involved in the market for much longer than, say, some of the Asian bidders, but also they've got more resource. They've got advisors who ultimately have deep knowledge versus necessarily some of our Asian counterparts. And so that, in a way, when I look at ultimately how the market has performed, and it doesn't surprise me that a majority of the buying this season has been American.
But they said so. So beyond Christie's.
Yeah, and more of a percentage, because where Asia had at least 20 or 30% of a position in the past, there are 2 or 3 bids. There was more Asian bidding last night at Sotheby's in the Impressionist department because of the material, because it was Impressionist, it was the Monets, etc. But at Christie's, the Joan Mitchell apparently went to an Asian collector, so that. It shows ultimately that, there's still very strong demand at the highest level, but most of these works are performing on 1 bid at the highest level. But when we look at, for instance, the Demon Corn, or even last night, the Rothko, that Sotheby's got a phenomenal price on a work on paper by Rothko, which, $25 million almost for a painting, which ultimately was estimated, 8 to 12 million. That was an incredible price. And there were 3 bidders on it, but the ultimate buyer was, again, difficult to know, but it was a Sotheby's representative who I would imagine is talking to an American by her own background. So again, that anomaly in a certain way, because what I was just saying earlier, if all the prices are generally selling to within their estimate span 1 or 2 bids, the breakout prices are actually the ones which we should be looking at, because what actually constitutes a breakout. So the Agnes Martin, for instance, at Sotheby's, which was also part of the Emily Fisher Landau, selling for $18.5 million. Phenomenal price, world record price for Agnes Martin. But we have to look at what that object was. It's one of 3 paintings which have gold and very specific kind of mark making. The other 2 paintings are in museums, so it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And interestingly enough, there was a lot of talk about the condition of that painting, and it wasn't as good as people really wanted, but you didn't have a choice. And in many ways, the people who bid on it actually told me, I mean, I know several people who participated. They basically said, we had to override the condition here because ultimately the painting is so good and so rare. So I think that in a way tells you a lot about what people are looking for. They're looking for that ultimate quality and something which really is standout, and they're willing to push well beyond any preconceived price when they go into competition. So that the Demon Corn fits exactly into that category. But on the other side, the Rothko doesn't. The Rothko is a beautiful example of a painting, but it's not something which actually you can say is a once in a lifetime position. And I think that comes down more to, I wouldn't say decorative market, but basically people falling in love with something and then just, 2 or 3 people having exactly that same love affair and pushing it all the way, and having enough financial power to do that. And I think that's one of the things that we've definitely seen in the last 3 weeks. There's a lot of money still in this market. So while we're talking about markets being, fluctuating, and ultimately, that there's a potential of a drop in a market, I don't see that as really being something which is inherent to the art market.
And what do you imagine about the future in the next 6 months?
I think what we're seeing is a recalibration of individual markets in real time, which means that while we're not seeing basically a drop in the market, we're seeing that individual artists are being, the price points are basically being determined either on a single object or on several objects that are coming for sale. And that ultimately we're not needing, therefore, a huge, financial drop in the market, which could happen if there's something on the outside world. War certainly could happen. A bigger escalation of the war can have that impact. The interest rates are a huge deterrent here around the world, but in America in particular, in the way that people are buying. So I think all these things have the outside impact on the art market, but the internal impact of the art market is, first of all, the auction houses themselves being a little less cavalier in what they're doing. When you have auction houses that have lost money, you hope that then the next season they're not being as aggressive in the way they're going after material, because at the end of the day, we can all say that the market is made up by the open market, but it's actually made up by a lot by the competition that occurs between the auction houses, because they're winning and pushing the prices up in order to win that material. And then by positioning that as the number that you have to go into the market, they then have to find someone to basically back it. So if you look at the Rouchet that was at Sotheby's in the Emily Fisher Landau sale, to go into the market and ask 40 million plus, there's a precedent. There was, radio had made it at that level, but it started at 30, and now you're going into the market asking for 40 at a time when there's a lot of concern as to where the future of the market is. So I think that situation was, literally came out of the competition between Sotheby's and Christie's to win the property, and then ultimately they had to deal with the consequences. But then the market has to deal with the consequences, because then you have a painting that feels, it made a good price, but it didn't make as good a price as it should have. And it's a lot of it's about the circumstances. So when I said earlier,
what about the future?
I think the future is going to be, as we've seen this season. I think we're going to have a healthy early 24. I think May 24 is going to be very similar to what we're seeing now, in that the auction houses are going to be leading the field in terms of the public perception of what's happening, because I think the art fairs also have changed. You know, we saw this year in the art fairs, the price points that people are willing to pay going further and further down, and primary being much more appealing as a way of accessing art in art fairs than ever before. And so I think, you know, yes, there was paintings, or there were paintings sold in art fairs. You know, the Rothko painting that Pace took to Paris didn't necessarily sell there, but it sold afterwards. So you are talking about, you know, $40+ million paintings still selling within, you know, at least the parameters of what an art.
They sold it?
I believe so. Yeah, you have to ask them, but that is what the market at least is telling us.
Okay.
But again, but that's very positive, because again, to see, you know, a Rothko, which had, you know, very much been on the market, ultimately finding a buyer, you know, in a, you know, after an art fair, all of this is good, because again, it shows, you know, not necessarily depth of buyers, but it shows ultimately focused buyers who ultimately, when they see something in person, not on the wall of a gallery, but actually in a public forum, you know, people can make choices. So I think, you know, to me, going back to your question, you know, where do I see the market? As I say, I think we've already seen individual recalibration of artists. We know artists who are very strong at the moment, and we also know where there's weakness. You know, we've seen weakness in Koons, we've seen weakness in Wool, we've seen weakness in many of the younger artists. We have to believe that those prices are coming down. I mean, there's no way that if you take out Asia, who have been the main providers of this very powerful younger generational push in the market, we don't have the buyers in America or Europe who necessarily were as aggressive. So when you have a Dana Schutz or whoever it might, I don't want to give, you know, individual artists here, but they all, you just have to look at a Hong Kong sale, and you'll see the artists that, you know, have been particularly put into the Asian categories. Those artists went to very high numbers, and now it's very more challenging to sell them at those high numbers. So the question there is ultimately, how well can that part of the market really hold up you know, so to me, if I'm really looking towards 24, I think there's going to be, there's going to be more conservatism generally in the way that we're all pricing. I think the biggest issue that still remains, and you know, remains in strong markets, is how to match buyer and seller. You know, I think the biggest challenges the auction houses had this season, and perhaps that's the reason why they had all these withdrawals, is ultimately they couldn't find a way to match the seller's expectation with what the buyers were willing to pay. So they withdrew the paintings out, or in other cases, they fight for the material and push high prices in order to get the material. So I think that ability, or that, you know, reckoning in a way of being able to persuade sellers that this is the real market. And that's why, in a way, that what you said earlier about the transparency or the lack of transparency by withdrawing these works, very difficult to then go to the sellers, then to the future sellers, and say, you know, we had a real trouble where, if you're looking at this artist, look how poor these works performed. If they disappear, it's very difficult, obviously, to use that as part of your argument. But I do think that is going to be one of the hopeful calling cards for the auction houses, is to say, you know, if you want to come to auction, if you want to sell at the art fairs, if you want to be, you know, all of us have to have the same language. We have to be more realistic in terms of what we can deliver. And I think that's, that's really where we are.
I see that you are taking your coffee. It's time to end.
I have to be very good not to drink it, but.
Merci, Brett.
My pleasure. Great as always.
À bientôt.